Well, let's try and unpack and at least understand why we saw the protests in the areas that we did last week. Well, community protests and social conflict are certainly not a new phenomenon here in post-apartheid South Africa. The protests some would even call a norm in local government for the past 27 years. Now, sadly, they often do end up being violent. Looting and damage to infrastructure does seem to go with that. Now, we've seen with the recent social and economic nature of the unrests in KZN and Gauteng, there's even more proof of that. It's raised a lot of questions. One of them, I'm sure, is does history keep repeating itself, and how do we change the course of history? Well, to answer that, it's always a pleasure to speak to Professor Cyril Mbatha from Rhodes University. Prof, what a pleasure to have you with us. There's a lot I want to talk to you about. One of those is going to be where to from here. If we haven't learned from this lesson, when are we going to start learning? But before I get to that, a lot of people would like me to ask you, if this was a supposed insurrection, depending who you speak to in government, the version changes, why was it only in Gauteng and only in KZN? Those two provinces seem to be problematic when it comes to protests and violence.
Good morning. Is it Tumelo and Jane and then viewers? Thank you so much for inviting me. Well, first of all, let me just say that the situation has just been becoming more and more conducive for this kind of stuff to happen, especially so probably since 2011. We know that after we tried to recover after the 2008 global recession, but from 2011 onwards, most economic indicators just began taking a nosedive, from foreign exchange rate, budget deficit, public debt, unemployment, social inequalities, the lot. And then we have the pandemic, where we lost 7% of GDP, especially in the informal sector. We had big shocks there. Also, there was a loss of pressure on our fiscus. So really the socio-economic environment or conditions were ripe for riots to happen. Plus, we currently under lockdown measures. We know how that sort of makes lots of people very nervous or very frustrated.
Prof, let me ask you this question quickly. A lot of people were arguing this position backwards and forwards, and I think many will agree with you that this is not a new problem. Been around for many, many, many years, that the incarceration of the former president, Jacob Zuma, was actually just the spark for the tinder to once again set off a big issue like this. So how much is to blame, do you think, having looked at the protests, on the incarceration of the former president, and how much of this do you think was the inevitable protests and looting that these two provinces were going to experience? How much of this do you think weighed on the former president?
Yes, so the whole country experienced the conditions that I've just described. So one would have expected that if there is a spark like the incarceration of the former president, that might affect the whole country, but it only affected two areas, specifically KZN and parts of Gauteng. And we know from the way that the former president himself has had been campaigning for support in the province. Each time he would have problems politically when he was still president, he would go to Moses Peter, rally up people there. So he had lots of support, especially in KZN. So when his arrest, when he was arrested, then the violence could then spark, or rather started flaring up from those areas. So, and we've seen since 1994, President Zuma himself was very key at ensuring that there's peace in the province during the IFP-ANC violence about 27 years ago. So it's very ironic that now, well, for that, actually, he became quite a hero in that area. So it's ironic that now, actually, his imprisonment becomes a spark in reversing the gains that the ANC had made in bringing up peace in those areas.
Prof, let me come to you for this last question, just very quickly, the last 30 seconds. I want your thoughts on this because the article that you referred to in on the Rhodes website asks a key question. Where to from here? I know it's a loaded question, but if you can give me a headline synopsis. Where to from here, in your opinion?
So I think the key thing is that the ANC sorts itself out. I think members of the ANC need to realize that through elections they can change their leadership if they decide to. At this point, it seems that people are trying to bypass democratic processes in changing the leadership. But if that is made clear that within the ANC itself, those processes are open, if they decide to change the leadership, they can do that instead of having the factional battles of trying to remove current leadership through violent means as opposed to through the vote.
As always, I appreciate your time in speaking to us, and I know there's so much we want to unpack and so many kinds of ramifications, but giving us a very basic synopsis of what is happening in Gauteng and also KZN regarding the protests and the looting. There's more to it, it seems, according to Professor Cyril Mbatha, and lots of lessons to be learned. Cyril Mbatha from Rhodes University.